Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. We're headed into our final segment of the day. We've been talking some NFL. Kirito is giving us his insight on some of the NFL quarterback prospect and development factors that come into play. The weather point is a very strong one in terms of necessarily the fit with Caleb Williams with the Bears, which is very interesting. But we are going to be talking some NFL rule changes that have been being thrown around during these owner meetings. We have a couple of different rules that have officially been passed. The biggest one so far is the fact that the NFL is banning the hip drop tackle, which does not come as too much of a surprise to me. For those of you who aren't necessarily aware of what a hip drop tackle is, it's essentially if you are coming from the side of a ball carrier or from behind as a defender, and it's wrapping them up and essentially just throwing all of your weight backwards and falling onto the player's leg. It's been a conversation for a couple years. It really started picking up traction, the idea of banning this type of play, when Mark Andrews got hurt in week 11 when the Ravens played the Bengals on primetime football. Ravens at the time were seen to be they were probably the betting Super Bowl favorites of that point, and losing their number one option on offense helped to spark this conversation. But I do see the argument for both sides. On one hand, player safety should be a priority in the NFL. Football is obviously a dangerous sport, though. It is just about impossible to fully remove injuries from any sport, let alone one as violent as football is. And no matter how hard the NFL tries, they're never going to be able to fully remove injuries. And that being said, we saw last year what happened with a lot of these quarterbacks, and the fact that so many of them went down that a record number of quarterbacks were starting the season as a whole, and ultimately it did lead to a decrease in some of the quality of a lot of these football games. And we want to make sure that we protect them, but this could come with other implications. I'm curious what it would mean for the increased injury rate to defenders, if possible, with all of these different restrictions on how they're allowed to tackle a ball carrier. It can become a very difficult situation here. Jonathan Jones of CBS has been reporting from this meeting, and he tweeted an interesting stat where there were 230 instances of the hip drop tackle this past season. 15 times the ball carrier missed time due to an injury from the play. So it's just 6% of the plays. Not tremendously high, but I also don't at this moment have the information necessarily on how long these players were out. And Kirito, I fully agree with your comment in terms of Kareem Jackson. Kareem Jackson is a defensive back in the NFL, and he has been targeted as this dirty player, but it almost goes back to sort of some of the conversations that, and I know Patriots fan here, but I'm not trying to, get on that too much, but Tom Brady has talked about some of the consequences of allowing all of these different rules to sort of stack up in favor of the offense, that it almost makes it the job easier for the quarterback, that they don't have to be as cautious when making throws to players. Kareem Jackson, I feel like there were a couple times in the past couple seasons where he's just making a football play, and ultimately, he gets tagged for defenseless or anything or along those lines. I don't think that's necessarily fair. A lot of these times, he's a hard-hitting safety, and that's something that, I believe he specifically referenced it, but if it wasn't him, it was maybe somebody in a similar comment, but like imagine Ed Reed, or specifically Ed Reed, obviously one of the hardest hitters of all time, or Troy Polamalu playing in today's game. They wouldn't be the level of, Hall of Fame caliber players, because they'd be spending so much time getting fined and suspended for these big time hits. And it's very difficult because, again, making sure that the best players possible are staying safe and that they're not getting hit with all these long-term injuries, we need to preserve that. But at the same time, there is just a level of what else are you supposed to do? Sean Taylor is a great example too. Landon Collins as well. All of these players are, some of the big time, most fun hitting safeties. If you go on YouTube and you were to look up, best hits of all time, a lot of them are ruled clean at the time. They just wouldn't survive in today's era. And, I understand the safety argument, but I do also wonder about how this can affect some of the defenders in terms of what they are allowed to do. Nobody that is, very strongly arguing for some of these moves has ever had to go and tackle the likes of Rob Gronkowski, for example, or these massive players that, sort of changed the way that the game was officiated. Players used to go low on the likes of a Gronk, and ultimately we've just banned so much different ways to play defense that I do feel like maybe we see things swing the other way in terms of defenders being at risk for injuries as well. But there's no denying this play has resulted, the hip drop that is, has resulted in some devastating injuries at times. But at the same time, again, 6% of, these specific plays and how often it happens, 230 instances on the year is about once a game. So it's not like it's the most uncommon thing, but I also feel like it doesn't necessarily fully restrict a ball carrier's season, and Jonathan Jones has been all over this subject. You can go check out his Twitter. I believe I'll find it by the time we get off here. I believe it's like JJones9, something along those lines, but he's been doing a really good, it's JJones9 on Twitter if you want to sort of keep up with some of his coverage. He's been helping me a lot with some of this, but he said that it's unlikely that this play is going to be flagged this season, or it won't be flagged often is what he said. And I'm curious what that means, whether they will give defenders a warning, or ultimately I think it's going to come down to fines. Again, we'll see what this fully means as the season plays out, but it is a very interesting conversation, as we also got reports leading into this where the NFL was supposedly worried about the dip in scoring the past couple seasons. Myself personally, I don't mind watching good defense. I think that it's such an underrated, awesome aspect of football, is the way we see these offensive spikes and then defenses adjust and make things harder. It's this constant chess match that goes on between offensive and defensive coordinators that I think is great for the game as a whole. And I don't know how much necessarily this specific example of a hip drop tackle could play into it, but again, it's just more things favoring the offense, which again, player safety is a very important thing. We saw once all these, big name quarterbacks got injured this season, not on this specific play, but we just saw with them being hurt, there's obviously a lot of controversy around some of the roughing the passer penalties. There's just a gray area where we do want to make sure that these players are actually in the game, because, one specific play where it's a stupid penalty versus, us not getting to watch a Patrick Mahomes type player in the playoffs because he suffered a dirty hit in the pocket. And a lot of the times, some of these flags are ridiculous and they're not dirty at all. But just as sort of a talking point, the fact that we have seen the injuries of quarterbacks really hinder the seasons as a whole, the quality of the NFL. And I'm just curious to see how this is going to continue to progress. Really, the one other big story that's come out so far, at least as of the taping of this show, is the NFL just passed something to allow a third challenge to come into place. And what leap do you think Jalen Milroe will have this year? That's an interesting question. I do think that with... So I'll finish off on this one quick thought on the challenges, and then I'll get into that. For the challenges, because I have it up on my phone here, where they a team will be permitted a third challenge if it is successful on at least one or both of its challenges. It's another very big conversation in the league, and we see it a lot in basketball, is the reviews and how long that all of these different replays that take away from the game itself, and it can be just a very slow process and takes away from the game itself. I understand that they want to get everything right, but it is interesting in terms of the flow of the game. Sometimes it can be very agonizing to watch, specifically in basketball. I feel like that is the case. We're going to finish off here on the thoughts on Jalen Milroe. I think Milroe is very interesting because we saw the way that he went from being benched to being able to come back into the starting lineup and be the player he was down the stretch of the season. He is such a prototypical college quarterback in my eyes, where he has all the physical tools, and what I was really impressed with, it was really funny to see with Alabama last year that when Milroe was sort of putting up some of his biggest numbers, it was, he was using his legs as well. The offensive line that started out miserable during the year, they sort of started to get themselves going. But, the arm of Milroe is just so talented on the deep balls that it is really impressive. And this is without necessarily a truly dominant wide receiver, as we've seen the wide receiver rooms in Alabama be completely stacked in years past. And Milroe was just able last year to, let it loose and pick up these big plays where it was either completing the pass himself or drawing flags down the field. And I do think that he can be somebody who, sort of as a developmental project, it's a little bit the more underneath stuff, the outside the numbers, that type of accuracy I don't think is fully there just yet. As you mentioned, being on the Falcons' radar, it's interesting because that would ideally be in the coming seasons. I don't believe he's draft eligible this year, but he plays a very different style of football than Kirk Cousins obviously does, which makes it a little bit hard to sort of game plan in a way that would benefit both Kirk Cousins and Milroe. And if you're a believer in Milroe over Kirk Cousins, I'm not the biggest Kirk Cousins guy. They just spent as much money as they did on Cousins. Now, they have an out after 2 or 3 years, so it's not like they are attached to him for the next half decade or anything. But I do feel like that's a little bit of a weird fit between Milroe and the Falcons. But, I think there are a handful of teams. I feel like the Eagles could be a team that I could see Milroe going to, in the fact that, he and Hurts both have the running ability. They have the good offensive line, and they have the deep threats in Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown. I know that there have been some A.J. Brown trade rumors. I can't imagine he's going anywhere, but some of the stuff between A.J. Brown and Jalen Hurts this season was a bit strange, and they have the option in Devontae Smith, who, either way, he is a burner of a receiver, and he could be a little bit of an Alabama connection there still too. I don't know. I feel like that could be a pretty interesting fit. Curious how the Alabama's going to be able to perform this year without Saban. They brought in the Washington coach. It's DeBoer, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that they brought in DeBoer. I'm going to double check that. Kalen DeBoer. So, Washington's offense last year was incredibly fun to watch. That was another situation where I thought that they had a very quarterback-friendly system. They had the weapons on the outside, obviously, in Polk and in Rome Odunze. But I think that he can bring a lot of that same talent to Alabama. Curious to see how he's going to utilize that. Seahawks are a very interesting fit as well, because they also have a guy in Sam Howell who I also think has sort of similar arm talent to Milroe, weirdly enough, where Milroe's, bigger built and everything than Howell, but they're both athletic, can both move around. Some of the decision making isn't always tremendous, and some of the underneath stuff isn't always, flawless, but both have pretty good arms down the field as well. And I could definitely see the Seahawks where they don't have necessarily a defined option going forward to, see how it progresses from here. It sounds like McDonald is set on Geno for the upcoming season. They like having Sam Howell in the building, but he's supposed to be the backup quarterback. I'm sure they will evaluate him there, evaluate Geno going forward, but I feel like he is probably on his way out of the Seattle starting job in the coming years. So Milroe, timeline-wise, could add up there as well. Wonder how high Milroe is going to go in a draft. The quarterback class as a whole next year is not as well-renowned as this year's draft, so could definitely see Milroe sort of working his way because of his physical tools being able to find their way into the first round, and as one of the top quarterbacks in next year's draft if the season goes well for him. We'll answer this final question here. We do have to get off soon because the GSMC Baseball Podcast will be starting very shortly. But as far as the Warriors, I don't know how much there is for them to do. They have such a high payroll that they don't have a ton of flexibility for this year. They get to cut ties with Chris Paul after this season, at least, to offload some of that. But they're going to continue to ride out the situation with Curry. They'll be able to likely restructure a deal with Clay as he's an expiring free agent, probably get him for cheaper. But they have so much money tied up in Draymond Green and Andrew Wiggins, and I like the value that Draymond brings to the team, but I really do struggle to feel like there were other teams out there that were willing to give him over $25 million a year, especially when I know the Pistons were one of the teams in talks for him, and the Trailblazers were another, and that just never really made much sense to me why either of those teams would pay $25 million for Draymond, who's a good player. But the Kings might have been in on the talk as well. I actually feel like that might have been a better fit than these other teams, but now they just have all of this wrapped up, and these players long term, that there's not a ton of flexibility. We talked about Wiggins last week and the contract situation that he's on. You're going to have to give up assets to go along with that. Now, whether the Warriors are willing to part ways with their young talent or not, the way that they've been able to develop the guys they have over the past few years at least gives them the option to potentially, trade some of them off to try and make a big time offer alongside Andrew Wiggins. It's just a big time question of what is there going to be that they can necessarily make that work. Getting Clay on a cheaper deal would be very helpful for that situation, because they would be able to as it currently stands with Clay, he's making a lot of money for the level of production that he's giving, and obviously it made sense when they gave him the contract at the time, but he is currently making $43 million against the cap, which is a ton of money to give up. So they get that restructured, probably have to find a way to make a deal with Wiggins. Talked last week about the potential of them trying to make an upgrade at the center position. Could definitely help them, but again, with these young pieces, and of course having Steph Curry, who's been dealing with some of these health issues with the ankle that he suffered against the Bulls a few weeks ago, that obviously doesn't help. But they do have a handful of different options, but I don't know if there is necessarily a right answer. I don't think we're going to get that right answer until we sort of see how the playoffs shake out. Not that I expect the Warriors to be a part of it, but again, the Cavaliers are a team that I'm definitely looking at in terms of if they fall short again, maybe trying to make a play for Jarrett Allen and try and add up some size to this roster. Such a shame that James Wiseman didn't work out for them, because you see some of the flashes. He still has so much athleticism, and he's been getting a little bit more playing time with the Pistons as of late. The consistency was never there with him. The IQ stuff definitely faltered during his tenure there with the Warriors, but you can see at least glimpses of why he was drafted as high as he was sometimes when he plays these games. But that is all we have time for today. Thank you very much for tuning in to the GSMC Sports Podcast. Thank you to the GSMC Sports Network for allowing us to host this show. Just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe to keep up with the show. We will be back here tomorrow at 2 o'clock Eastern Time, and we will see you then. Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. Nice.